get a little more insight into this conversation, live from New York City, we are joined by Professor of International Relations, David Monda of the City University of New York Guttman Community College. Good afternoon, Professor Monda.
Good morning from New York, and thank you for having me.
It's good morning. Good morning to you from New York. We just missed the mark there, but we were okay. Almost there.
Yeah. You're fine. You're fine. Yes.
So this is a very big topic that can't be tackled in one sitting, obviously, but we'll try to get some questions answered. So as per the introduction, the recent elections held across the continent leave a lot to be desired. So can you tell us why the tenets of democracy, such as free and fair elections, have failed to take root in Africa?
So I think there's a range of issues in relation to democracy and the continent. Let's not forget we have 55 different countries in the continent, and the grade for democratic consolidation is different from one country to another. Some countries are doing better, some countries are doing worse. I'll give the example of the recent election in Tanzania, where we saw real contention in relation to how the election was conducted. The opposition complained of intimidation, complained of rigging of the election. And actually, at the end of the election, the main opposition candidate, Tindi Lissu, fled into exile to Belgium, and a couple of the other opposition figures crossed the border into Kenya to seek asylum. So we see a challenge there. We see a challenge also in Ivory Coast with Alassane Ouattara winning the contentious election there. The opposition boycotted it. And also Alpha Conde in Guinea, and challenges from the opposition, Cellou Diallo. So I think it's a range of issues, but I think one of the main ones is the incumbent regime in many of these countries, the ruling party not willing to allow for free and fair elections and for there to be equitable space for the opposition to also challenge for the elective positions, whether it's from the presidency, even to the members of parliament. I think also in relation to our traditions and norms of democratic elections in Africa, we also have a problem from the opposition side where the opposition in many cases will never concede defeat, even in the event that the elections have been conducted in a free and fair environment. The opposition always seem to cry foul, even in the event sometimes that there's no evidence that elections were fraudulently held. So it's a mixed bag. And as I said, the continent has over 55 countries. Some countries are doing better and some countries are doing worse. Like Ghana, the past elections in Ghana, for example, were well conducted. We saw in Nigeria an incumbent president losing an election, which is a really good sign for democratic consolidation on the continent. And going forward, Ghana has elections coming up pretty soon next year. So we'll be looking to see if those trends will continue, as happens in Uganda and also in Kenya in 2022.
Professor, I have to ask your opinion on this. Now, if you look at government offices, obviously they are put in power by the people that vote for him, and that's how they ascend into that position. Now, as with any institution, if you do a good job, the people will essentially want to keep you in that position. So what do you think is wrong with government institutions with understanding that perhaps if I do a good job, I might actually stay in power a little bit longer, as opposed to whether or not this actually works, I still want to hold on to what I am currently doing right now? Professor Monda, are you able to get me? Okay, the connection seems to be quite bad, so I'm just going to ask you to repeat the beginning of your answer as we try to stabilize.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay,
we can hear you now.
So, okay, great. So, I mean, as I'd mentioned, I think part of the issue is incumbent leaders who are in office many times don't necessarily have faith in peaceful transitions of power. We've not had very many peaceful transitions of power on the continent. So if in a lot of cases, even though the president's doing a good job, they're not always sure about whether the opposition candidate or anybody that takes them out of office will not purge them or revenge for the acts of the incumbent government. So I think there's a problem with transitions of power. These are not very much consolidated, and they're not very prevalent on the continent. So I think that's one problem around the angst that incumbent governments feel, not only about conducting free and fair elections, but also about exiting power and what the opposition would do when they get into power. I think secondly is also in relation to the electorate. As I'm sure you're aware, one of the major challenges we have on the continent is we mobilize around ethnicity in many of our sub-Saharan African countries. And we don't necessarily mobilize around ideology and on principle and ideas. And I think this then creates its own problems, because holding leaders to account is not always so much about what they've done while in office, but it's more around ethnicity and issues of ethnic and regional mobilization. So I think that's the second element to that. And then the third element, in some countries, for example, if you think of the case of Sudan, you think of the case of South Sudan also, there's the dark hand of, or even Zimbabwe, there's a dark hand of the military. So the military may be behind the scenes. They may not actively be engaged in takeover of power, but really you find the individuals, the power behind the civilian rule is really the military. So that's also another dynamic that creates these problems. So on one hand, lack of peace, tradition of peaceful handover of power. Secondly, ethnic mobilization is a big issue in terms of ethnicity rather than ideas and ideology. And thirdly, external forces. And on our continent, the military is a big player in relation to this.
I see. So now one other issue that is usually pointed to is the matter of multipartism in most African countries. Now, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think multipartism, by and large, since the 90s, Zambia was the flag bearer in terms of democracy on the continent. Zambia led the way on multipartism. We had the MMD take the long-time party of President Kaunda out of power, and that was incredible. That was a huge movement, and it led to democratization and multi-party democracy in most of the rest of the continent. I think the problem today is not so much about whether we have multi-party elections, but whether we really have genuine, free and fair elections with access of the opposition engaging with the ruling party, having a fair chance at winning power. Because if you look on most of sub-Saharan Africa, we have multi-party politics, but do those opposition parties, do those government parties actually have solid ideological platforms on which they stand? And when we have elections, will those elections be free and fair? Let's take the example, for example, of Uganda, right? So we've had the Yoweri Museveni's party, in office, but even fairly recently, even as early as yesterday, a few days ago, the opposition leaders were being arrested, their meetings were being cancelled, they were being harassed. You saw this also in Tanzania, where they have Chama cha Mapinduzi, and they have a lot of other opposition parties. But the opposition parties are not given the chance to campaign during elections. They are not given the chance to challenge the ruling party for power. So we've moved, thankfully, from the dictatorships of single-party regimes of the 80s and early 90s into a space where multipartism is the norm. However, I think we need to really deepen democracy to the extent that these opposition parties and ruling parties can actively compete and engage in the political process, and that we create space for there to be peaceful transitions of power in the event that the ruling party loses power and an opposition candidate is able to win. And we've seen this in Ghana. This happened peacefully in Ghana. We've seen this happen peacefully in Nigeria. So it's definitely something that can happen.
I see. Now, we have to also talk about the issue of funding. I think I wouldn't call it a misconception, but I would refer to it as something that is often overlooked, is that getting into politics, especially African politics, is not cheap. So who do you think holds more sway in the decision-making of governments? Is it the funders or the followers?
I think it's definitely funders, and if you look very generally, I'm talking again very generally across the whole continent, we'll see that.
Professor Monda, can you get me? Professor, are you there? Professor Monda, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask if you can just repeat the beginning of your question once again. We did lose the line just there.
Sure. So I think part of the issue there is the challenges on the funders, and in many of our African countries, we'll see that the funding for the ruling party is not separated from the state. In other words, the state and the ruling party, the party in office, are the same. And the opposition, in many cases, is denied funding. So this gives the ruling party an unfair advantage. I think, secondly, even in the event of, in a lot of African countries, like in Kenya, where I'm from, where you find that you have, a quota or an allocation of state funding to parties in parliament, equitably based on the number of seats that they have in the legislature. The government in many cases also has additional pots of money that it can use to fund its campaigns. So the issue of funding and campaigning is not only uniquely an African problem, it's a problem we have here, even here in the United States, the overwhelming problem of money in our politics. I just think in our continent, there needs to be a more clearer delineation between state resources and the resources of the ruling party, and creating mechanisms through which the opposition parties can actually be able to access and get support and funding to advance their causes. May I also mention in conclusion that in addition to the political parties, it's very important that we have strong civil society organizations that are on the ground and can pressure not only the government and the opposition to advance the public good and create democratic spaces for everybody. And in particular, one of the big issues we have on the continent is this whole issue of affirmative action and around ethnic minorities, some of the more disadvantaged indigenous groups, and women, and thinking about, for example, creating equity quotas or gender quotas to create special seats for women so that women can also get represented, because that's a major issue we have on our continent, not only in relation to funding, but also funding that's tied to increasing the democratic space, because in many of African countries, women are marginalized. They're not actively involved in the politics, and we need to hear more women's voices, more voices of indigenous communities that have been marginalized, in many of our African countries.
I see. Now, my final question to you, Professor. Professor Daniel Osabukule, in his 2000 book, Compatible Cultural Democracy, The Key to Development in Africa, he posits that for Africa to develop, we must be able to incorporate African values into a cultural democracy best suited for us. Now, what's your take on this?
I think I agree with him on one hand, but I think I would also disagree with him on another. And I agree with him in the context that, democracy needs to be culturally understood and needs to be tuned to the needs of the particular population. So we can have democracy under a range of systems. You can have parliamentary democracy, you can have systems under presidential systems, which are also democratic. You can also have a hybrid, right? So you have where you have a prime minister and you have a presidential system, hybrid systems in that form. You can have consociational democracy. I agree with him to the extent that democracy needs to speak to the particular culture of the people. But I think we cannot conflate democracy and make it culturally specific when people are being denied basic rights. I think there's other elements of democracy that I think we need to be careful about so that we don't make democracy culturally relative. So that, for example, the basic tenets, when people people are not free to express themselves, when people don't have free and fair elections, when people don't have, opposition parties don't have equal access to media coverage, when basic issues of gender equity in the political space are not addressed. These are not issues of culture. These are universal values about fairness, about liberty, about equity. And I think those are the tenets of democracy. So to the extent, yes, that certain democratic models work better in certain environments, I'd agree with his thesis in that context. However, I also believe democracy in certain other elements is universal and specific to issues of justice, issues of fairness, equity, and liberty. I think those are universal values, whether you're in China, whether you're in New York, Lusaka, Nairobi, Cape Town, or in Cairo. There's certain basic elements about fairness to humanity that are universal and are central to democratic governance.
Professor, I have to thank you for your time. That was actually very insightful. Not exactly what I expected for your answer on that one. So thank you for that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.